Here we are for part 2 with our favorite pen, Magenta. Magenta. 10 minutes. Minor parties in America. So we talked about the major two parties, but there are also minor parties. You can see bolter parties, meaning groups of people that leave one of the major parties. Farmer labor parties, we've had those over time. Parties of ideological protest, and single issue parties. Parties of ideological protest might be something where it's their goal might not necessarily getting people elected, but more similar to an interest group where the Libertarian Party, they really believe in the principles of libertarianism, and it's not something that they're necessarily willing to compromise. Single issue parties, there is such thing as, I can't remember, it's like a right to life party, I think is what it's called, and their main issue is trying to make abortion illegal, and so that would be a single issue party. Why a two-party system? Part of it has to do with because of the way our electoral system is set up, where if you win, for the presidency, if you win a majority of the electoral votes, then you become the president. Coming in second or third doesn't get you anything. The same thing happens at the state level with senators and representatives. If you're voting for a new senator, and 1/3 of your state votes for the Green Party, it doesn't matter. There isn't going to be a third of the Senate represented by Green members. It's winner take all. Whoever wins, the Democratic Party or Republican Party, they get to have their representation. It's different from a lot of European parliamentary systems where you go and vote, you vote for a party, and then whatever proportion of the votes they get, then that proportion of their legislature would be from that party. So for example, if we all voted and 20% of America voted for the Green Party, then 20% of Congress would need to be members of the Green Party. But that's not the way ours is set up, and so it reinforces the idea of two-party systems. In order for a smaller party, a third party, to get elected, they have to win a whole state or a whole congressional district, and that obviously is much more difficult. Political socialization allows the parties to persist. So we talk about, when you sit down with your parents and have discussions about political parties and voting, it's likely that you talk about Republicans and Democrats, that you don't talk about libertarians or American Independence or Reform Party or Green Party and those kinds of things. So it's sort of like it just reinforces itself, the idea that there's just the two parties, and you wouldn't vote for a third party. You can see here, this is an interesting chart. This shows the candidates and what parties they're from. And you can see 1/3 of the candidates, roughly, are not Republican or Democrat. They're from these other parties, but they get much less than 1/3 of the vote. You can see here 1%, less than 1%, less than 1%, less than 1% because that's others. And then, half the vote Republican, a little bit less than half the vote Democrat. This was in 2004, but these numbers are pretty consistent. So they are running candidates, these other parties, but they're not getting very many votes. In the 2004 presidential election, you can see who they voted for, and you can see there's Republican, Democrat, George Bush, and John Kerry by far get the most votes. And in third place, Ralph Nader on either, depending on the state, which ticket he was on, as an independent or the Populist Party or the Reform Party. And then you can see there was a Libertarian candidate, and they're getting less than 1% of the vote. So a couple 100,000 people are voting for them, but not the millions of people voting that you would need to actually win. And then, there's tons and tons of different parties that are getting some votes. Look at Earl F. Dodge from the Prohibition Party. He got 140 votes. Those people don't want you to drink. Federal basis of the party system. Party politics on the state and local levels often function quite differently than on the national level. You can have a Democratic president, for example, and then you could easily have a Republican lost my train of thought because I got a text message. I apologize. How unprofessional of me. So, you might have it could be more partisan on a local level. It could be less partisan on a local level because it's sort of a smaller version of smaller arena. Then the things, it can be very different. So you could have many Republican governors and a Democratic president, for example, even though they're both chief executives in their own way. It works out that way. It's part of our federal nature. Some people would say I'd rather have, a Republican national government and a democratic state government, because I think social welfare is still important, but it's something that should be handled at the state level. And if that's something that you feel, then maybe you would want a national government that would be more Republican, that would favor smaller government, but then you would still want a state government that was more concerned about social welfare, and then you would elect those leaders at the state level. And that's something that we have the opportunity to do in our federal system, which I think is a good thing. You can see here, this is what people would say are their parties. You can see that a lot of, sort of the trend that's interesting is that the number of people that claim they're independent is growing, and the number of people that claim that they are Republican or Democrat is shrinking. So more people are less likely to identify with a party than they are to say that they're independent, and they're willing to look at candidates from either party and make decisions sort of based on their own principles. And then this chart is interesting because it talks about which party, Democrat, Republican, or Independent, by how much money you make. So wealthier people tend to be more Republican, poorer people tend to be more Democrat. By education, there's sort of it kind of comes and goes. The less educated you are, as you get more educated, you become more Republican. But then if you get too educated, then you become more Democrat again. It's sort of interesting trend lines to see that. By religion, gender, ethnicity, region of the country you live in, and by your age. So these are all interesting things to look at. And if I were you, I would spend some time looking at this chart and being familiar with some of these trends, because sometimes questions come up, and if you're familiar with the general trends, you can usually do quite well with the question. I would not spend time trying to memorize all of these. I would look for patterns and try to be familiar with those patterns. There's obviously huge differences between not huge, I shouldn't have said huge. There are obviously differences between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats tend to want to spend money for social welfare. Republicans, their priorities are either cutting spending or spending more on defense, and we see that in today's discussions about the deficit and what to spend money on and what not to spend money on. Republicans want to cut social welfare programs. Democrats want to combine cuts in social welfare with cuts in things like defense with raising some taxes, and the Republicans are like, no, don't raise taxes. So there's obviously differences. Ideological gap between activists in the two parties, and so the people that are Republicans that are most likely to go and protest and to organize and be politically active are very different than the same people in the Republican Party that are willing to go out and speak and advocate and protest or whatever that is. So sort of the more extreme is probably an inappropriate word, the more motivated members of the party from the two parties are very different from each other. And then their platforms are different, but despite these differences, they are similar, and here's the key, in that they are both capitalist and they both reject government ownership of means of production. So economically, they're really very similar. The differences are relatively minor, especially when compared to other countries and political parties in other countries. Here in the United States, the Republicans and Democrats are actually pretty close together, but they make a huge deal out of their differences, and so that's what we're very aware of, and we think that they're so opposite from each other. But in the big picture, they really aren't. Neither one is arguing against capitalism, or, but it's fun to say that they are. That's fine, you can say that. But neither of them is advocating a totalitarian state. They're not going that extreme. And there are political parties that get votes in other countries that have those kind of representation. The party can be organized at the national level, and so, for example, there's a national committee, there's a national convention, they have congressional party conferences, they have congressional campaign organizations, and so it's sort of the idea of supporting the party at the national level, and then some of this help can trickle down to the state level and help out. The role of the national committees has changed, though. The Democrats were trying to be more inclusive in choosing convention delegates, and the Republicans were focusing on strengthening fundraising. And so in the 1970s, they're trying to reinvent themselves. And the Democrats are, we're trying to be more inclusive of everybody, and not just, the traditional white guy who's in charge, who's involved in politics. We want to be inclusive and reach out to all groups of people. And the Republicans said, we think that a way to help us get more members elected is if we really build a strong fundraising base. Party machines, sort of like if you would vote for the local candidate, if it was a Democratic candidate or a Republican candidate, and then you would know that they would help you out in exchange for your vote. So maybe a mayor, if you vote for Mayor Smith, and Mayor Smith's going to take care of you and your family and make sure you have a job. Well, now that the federal government, especially after the Great Depression, has a much larger role in providing social services, I don't have a job, but I can get welfare, I can get unemployment insurance from the federal government, then I don't need my mayor who is going to give me that in exchange for my vote for him. I don't need him to be in office. And so that's sort of what party machines used to function as, and it's really not as prevalent anymore. American political parties are among the most decentralized in the world because what happens is, the California Republican Party doesn't necessarily have to do what the National Republican Party is doing, or the Republican Party of the County of San Diego. There's a lot of sort of local organizations, and they can have different strategies and goals and purposes, although they're certainly going to be very, very similar. They're not beholden to the higher organization. The county of the Republican Party of San Diego County doesn't have to do everything the state Republican Party or the National Republican Party tells them to. They might have different goals at the local level, which is important and fine. How well they link voters to government, blah, 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 blah. I think we're getting near the end. You can see ideologies of party voters and party delegates. So what happens is you can see the delegates to a convention, for example, are more likely to say, they're more likely to say that they are liberal, and they are much less likely to say that they are conservative. And then the Republican voters, it's the same thing. The delegates, here's the point. The delegates tend to be more extreme. Republican delegates tend to be more conservative. Democratic delegates tend to be more liberal than just the general population of the voters. Okay, I'm mangling the point of this chart, but the idea is that the delegates tend to be more extreme, and that's why sometimes you get candidates from the different parties that are less appealing to moderate voters, or the middle, if you will, and that's why sometimes you get a choice between a very conservative Republican or a very liberal Democrat, because the delegates, the people that are more involved in choosing these people, tend to reflect that. I think this is the last slide. Parties should present the 4 principles of responsible party government. So goals, things that essentially the textbook authors are saying that party government should make parties. The party should have clear programs for the voters. So this is how we envision the purpose of government being. These are the things we're going to do if we're elected. Voters should choose candidates on the basis of those programs. So they should say, I believe that program is valid and that would be important and helpful for me and my community. That's who I'm going to vote for. The winning party should carry out its program once it's in office. So they said they're going to do it. They should actually do it. And then voters should hold the governing party responsible at the next election for executing its program, meaning if they do a good job, they get reelected. If they don't do a good job, then you don't elect them again. And then they do a good job of 1 and 3. So they do a good job of giving a program, and they do a good job of trying to carry out their program once they're in office. Voters, on the other hand, are not holding up their end of the bargain by choosing candidates on the basis of programs. They're choosing candidates maybe because of a soundbite, or the way they appear on TV, or just one specific issue that might or might not even be within the realm of responsibility of that office that they're running for. And then voters will not necessarily hold the candidates accountable the next time. Even if they didn't carry out the program that they said they would, they're still going to get reelected because it's very partisan. Done! No idea how long that was. Hopefully it wasn't too long.